doing that. I'm going to talk about a statistician that I admire, and talk about the qualities I admire in them. In fact, I'm going to talk about not an individual, I'm going to talk about an amalgam. I'm going to talk about what I see in all of the statisticians, all the good things in statisticians that I've seen since I've been doing this job, bearing in mind that I've only really encountered statisticians since I've been doing this job 2 years ago, and before then I was on the dark side as an accountant. So I'm going to talk about the qualities I admire in statisticians as a profession. The first thing I admire is the philosophy that statisticians deploy. I think before I came to the world of the GSS, I thought that statisticians counted things. And I think probably at our worst, statisticians do fall into the trap of simply counting things. But the best statisticians, and the ones I really admire, have a philosophy of saying, out there in the world is the phenomenon that people want us to estimate. It might be the volume of crime in society. It might be the experience of road safety. It might be inflation. And the statistician thinks it's my job to get as close as I can to helping people understand that phenomenon, and data is my tool. There's a sense that there's a reality out there that you can never quite perfectly measure, but you can get as close to it as you can. And that's much more powerful than simply saying, well, our computer says there's 300 of whatever. I think that's a very powerful philosophy, and I hadn't come across it before. And I think it's one of the great strengths of statisticians, is thinking that the job is to estimate phenomena in the world. With that philosophy comes a second quality, which is this honesty about uncertainty. This willingness to acknowledge that the estimates, the measurements that a statistician makes are inevitably uncertain, and to go beyond that, to actually measure the uncertainty, to come up with tools for putting a figure on the uncertainty. That's a very, very powerful quality that statisticians have. And those two things come together, I think, in a third quality, which I call integrity, although this is exactly the same presentation I gave in September. I've spoken to several groups about it, and I think if I was to do it again, I'd change that word for courage. I think there's a real courage in deploying the philosophy I described, being honest about uncertainty, and sometimes having to say to people who don't really want to hear it, actually, the answers aren't as certain as you want them to be. I have to caution you, this is what a statistician might say, I have to caution you that you can't place too much reliance on these figures. And I see statisticians doing that a lot, and I think it takes a great deal of courage, of integrity, to make that stand. Those first three things, philosophy, uncertainty, and courage, integrity, are kind of values that statisticians have. I also admire some of the more practical things that statisticians do in doing your work. The first is, statisticians are really superb at understanding complexity. All of your training and your practical day-to-day work is about taking very complex data sets and making sense of them. Really good example of this is in the Department for Work and Pensions for GB, where they have some problems about how they record sanctions, people who've had sanctions on their benefits because they've not complied with certain requirements. It's now the case that the department no longer goes to the operational people, the job centre people, or the economists, or the IT people to understand what's going on with the sanctions. They go to the statisticians. It's the statisticians who helped the department understand these complex data sets and what's going on within them, the patterns and so on. So I think understanding complexity is a very, very powerful attribute of statisticians. Partnerships, statisticians inevitably work in partnerships. I think there's probably no better evidence of that than NISRA. Your whole model, the seconded out model, is sort of it's embedded partnership. That's how you work. But I see that across the GSS very powerfully, this capacity to work with both policymakers but also other professions, economists, operational researchers and so on. Very, very strong quality. Also reflected in innovation. How many of you were at the GSS conference in September? Did any of you get to attend? You, Alana, anyone else? I mean, it was quite remarkable, the overwhelming how much innovation was going on across the GSS. I don't know if you felt that,
Yeah,
but it was
a really good opportunity to be with so many different departments from across England as well. So they were doing, and it was very innovative. Some of the talks that were done as well. Some of the people actually going into different countries and what they were doing to try and help with no data and really starting up into the journey. It was really interesting.
You're talking about the DFID, the difference,
yeah. It's really interesting to me, and how they were actually out to the field and sort of building data collection. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, one example, but I think in general, the attribute that I see in statisticians, which was reflected at the GSS conference, is this quality of being innovative, always looking for new ways of understanding the phenomenon in the world that you're trying to estimate. Really very powerful. And then the final thing, which in a way this is what's blown me away the most, is this capacity to navigate. And what I mean by that is, if you think about what the head of profession in a department, the head of NISRA as an agency, or any of you who are working within departments, what you have to do is, in a sense, you have to navigate two competing forces. Of course, you have to serve the interests of the department, of the government of the day. It goes without saying as civil servants. But secondly, you've always got to remember that you're producing statistics which serve the public good. You produce things which, by their definition, go out into the public domain. And most of the time, those two interests are aligned. Most of the time, what's good advice for your department, helping them make operational decisions, are aligned with what's good transparent information to help the public understand. But there are times when that's not the case. There are times when there's a kind of pull in two directions. And what really amazes me is how the GSS has managed to create leaders who are capable of navigating between those two things and never too far go one way or too far go the other, and are able to hold a course between them. It's really, really quite remarkable, and I think that the GSS don't talk enough about how remarkable it is. There's no other profession like it. The accountants, my profession, don't have to face this at all. The economists don't, because they don't do very much, which is overtly public-facing. Operational researchers don't. Social researchers a little bit, but they don't have what I'm going to come on to, the code of practice, which sort of defines for them exactly where they should be paying their attention. I think it's really remarkable, this skill of navigation, and it relies on all of the previous qualities of courage and of partnership and so on. But in itself, it's really, really amazing. So those are my 7 qualities that I admire in the statisticians that I've seen. The philosophy, the honesty about uncertainty, the integrity and courage, the partnerships, the understanding complexity, this innovation and this skill of navigation. I think they all point to impact and influence. That's what they all sum up to, is impact and influence. What I'd be interested to know is, I've got a list of 7 things there, which may be more than you've got on your list, but I've had a lot longer to do it, because I've prepared this talk for some time, whereas you only had a minute. I'd be fascinated to know whether the things that I admire in statisticians in general reconcile or align with the things that you've got written down in the one person that you picked out in your mind. So the easiest way to do this is, were there any exact matches? Were any of my attributes exactly things that you admired in the statisticians that you were thinking of? Tracy?
Yeah, my person's Florence Nightingale, and what I've written is that she was very good at analysing the world around her as a child, and she was very interested in using data and then as she grew up specifically for the public good. So it's that idea of complexity, I think, is the one that it matches best with.
And philosophy as well.
And
You know,
philosophy,
looking out
yeah.
into the world, and I'm getting to understand the world
Yeah.
using data. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Very good. Any other matches between my 7 and any of the things you've got written down?
I have the word integrity written down.
Fantastic,
Yeah.
fantastic. There's no prize, I'm afraid, for a perfect match, but I think we should say bingo at this point. That's very good. So you'd definitely advise me not to change it to courage. Okay, I won't, for your sake.
I had courage.
You had courage? Oh, now I've got to navigate. I've got to navigate between the two of you. And any other exact matches or similar ideas?
I had honesty, which I think is very closely
Yeah.
linked to integrity.
Yeah, that fits very, very, very well. Yeah. Any of you had things which I didn't have on my list? Very different things.
Authoritative?
Authoritative. Yeah, if you don't mind, the ones which are different, I'm actually going to capture because they're just all useful and interesting stuff. So authoritative. Yeah, do you want to say a little more about that?
No, I think it speaks for itself.
And communication.
Communication is very, very interesting. It's come up. So as I say, I've done this about 5 times now, and it's the one thing that consistently people are capturing. They're saying the statistician they admire, they're thinking of somebody who's a really, really good communicator. Is there anything you'd like to add to that about the person you're thinking of without naming them?
Well, I think generally you can get lost in the detail of things, and sometimes statisticians are very interested in the detail, but the people that they're doing the work for are not so interested in the detail, and sometimes it's necessary to sort of get a more big picture rather than actually having the detail available, but sometimes it's just really the headline that people want, and of course it comes with like error bars and so on, but I think being able to communicate one sort of a simple story where you can, I think is very important.
Very good, thank you. Anybody else have something along the lines of communication? Quite a few. Do you want to set the thing?
I had passionate about presenting stats in an interesting way.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's a great phrase. Do you mind if I write that down?
Absolutely.
Anyone else with sort of something on the communication slide?
Well, not for the ability to explain.
Yeah.
Pauline's phrase is better than mine, but and it's sort of like simplicity from complexity.
Oh yeah, and that's quite, in a way, linked to my understanding complexity as well. But again, better expressed, I think, simplicity from complexity. So, are there any attributes that you've got listed in your model statistician that we haven't yet mentioned?
And approachable now?
I think that's a first, actually.
I had it down to you.
That's really interesting. So obviously approachability is a quality that the Minister of Statisticians particularly value, whereas such as in the Health and Safety Executive and the Department for Education in Whitehall don't value approachability as much as you guys do. So that's I'm sure there's some kind of anthropological study which can be done to discern the differences. Anybody else have an approachability type thing?
I had a very good people person. I had the phrases were an excellent leader and a very good people person, which comes into some of those things about navigation and I suppose they're just very encompassing terms, but they pick up on lots of navigation and communication and some of those influencing type issues. Very generic.
Yeah, no, it's really good, thank you.
Inquisitive mind.
Oh, that's a nice one, yeah. Interestingly, that hasn't come up very much. A little bit in some of the other sessions, but not a lot. It's very That's nice. That's a nice one. Do you want to say a little bit more about the person you have in mind?
Ian just always asking why. It's like, here's some figures. Why is that like that? Oh, okay. Here you go.
Yeah.
Like, why is that like that? Okay.
And I
Just
suppose in a
encouraging
way
you to
that
think yourself.
that links into the philosophy, doesn't
Yeah.
it? That there's a phenomenon in the world to be described, and if you start from that kind of leads into lots of why questions, doesn't it? Okay. I'm about to move on. Are any of you really keen to share with your colleagues the attribute you've got written, which we haven't come on to yet? No? Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on now. I'm going to now talk about the bit which is a bit more clearly the trailer for what we're going to do next year to take stock of the code of practice. The purpose of that exercise, though, was to just step back a little bit. Why are we interested in the code of practice as the authority? Well, we think it's the thing which helps statisticians have the impact and influence that we have. I wanted you to think about what are the attributes that statisticians really have at their best, and then start to think about how the code might support, encourage, and endorse those. Code of practice, of course, is something I hope you're all familiar with. We want to undertake a stock take of it because we think it needs to come out of the shadows a little bit. We think it's relatively undervalued by policymakers and by other professions, and possibly even within the GSS as well. And because we haven't talked about it in the kind of way I'm going to encourage us to talk about it enough, I think some myths have grown up about it, and we want the stock take to challenge those myths. But before I say any of that, I'd like you to do one other exercise, and this is the piece of paper you're going to give me. So I'd like you to summarise the code of practice for criminal statistics in one word. When you think about it, what do you think? So, just while you're finalising the word you're going to choose, here are a few of the things that people have said to me in a word cloud. And the purpose of your handing them in to me is that I want to make this word cloud a bit richer and more words in it. I don't know what you're laughing for. When I put this slide up, everybody laughs. I can't imagine why. So there's some pejorative terms, and there's also some constructive terms in there. So I'm going to talk about now, for the next maybe 15 minutes, 10 minutes, what we see in the code and the way in which the code of practice supports the qualities of impact and influence that I talked about in the first section. How does the code support impact and influence? The first way the code supports impact and influence is very directly. I think it gets statisticians an authoritative voice. It gets us in the door with policymakers and ministers and others in a way that would not be conceivable in the absence of a standard code of practice, which was the same across the whole of UK government. A really good example of that is the Ministry of Justice in Whitehall. The head of profession there, Steve Elliott, saw that he had a new Secretary of State, new special advisors, and actually some new people in the communications side. And shortly after the general election in May, he held a session on the code of practice, talking them through the sort of do's and don'ts, the ways in which the code supports good dissemination of information, and the things to avoid. I don't think it would have been remotely possible for him to have that conversation, for them to even have space for him, had there not been he could say, no, there's this general thing called the code of practice, and it's really worth your while to listen to it. So I think it really sort of directly gives us a reason to be at the table. I think that's very, very powerful. The second thing I think that the code does is that actually it supports innovation. If there is an all-encompassing myth about the code, it might be that it's inhibiting of innovation, and that's the myth that we want to bust. If you actually read the code, you read the principles of the code, they are very permissive and encouraging of innovation. They talk about continuous improvement, they talk about meeting user needs, they talk about dissemination and finding ways of disseminating statistics and putting them in the hands of the people who are interested in them. All things which are very conducive to innovation. And actually you can see lots and lots of innovation happening. It's one of the attributes I detect in statisticians that I admire. Lots of innovations going on. However, I think it's possible that there's a perception that the code inhibits or discourages innovation, and that's really what we want to take on and get people to look at the code for what it is, not for the myths that are built up around it. I think it's very permissive and encouraging of innovation. The third thing about the code, which I think is very conducive to statisticians having impact and influence, is that it supports the professional standing of statisticians in government. One of the great things it does is it gives us a really common language. In other words, you could move from NISRA to the Scottish Government, and somebody from the Scottish Government could move to the Met Office, and somebody from the Met Office could move to DWP, and somebody from DWP could move to the Welsh Government, and somebody from the Welsh Government could come to NISRA. You could do a big carousel, and you'd find that the new place that you arrived at, you'd be using familiar terms and concepts and disciplines. And that's what being a profession is. What makes lawyers professionals is that they've got a common set of tools and frameworks that enable them to move around and have a language that helps them express their profession. I think the code is incredibly important in supporting the professional standing of statisticians. And I'd like to encourage us to all think of it in that way. And then the final aspect of influence that I think the code really supports is that other people look at the code and look at the GSS and think, we'd like a bit of that. I think some of the other professions in government, particularly operational research and social research, are quite envious of the strength of the code of practice. But there are also other organisations who are on the fringes of government who are starting to imitate the code. So I've got some examples here. The Greater London Authority has established its own code of practice, as has the Bank of England. The Treasury has always said that it doesn't produce official statistics. And yet, if you looked at the most recent Treasury budget, the summer budget for 2015, I'm not sure if you can read that, so I'll read it out for you. It says, this is the data sources, which is the sort of annex to the Treasury report itself. This document also ensures that the Treasury meets the standards set out by the UK Statistics Authority to comply with the Statistics and Registration Services Act 2007. In particular, this document aims to meet two of the requirements of the UK Statistics Authority Code of Practice for Official Statistics. What's going on there is that the Treasury is sort of pulling the code towards them as a cloak, as a sort of as a way of endorsing their legitimacy. Now we might say that that's not something that we'd really feel entirely comfortable with if the underlying stuff isn't any good, and that's not the point. The point is they look at the code and they